Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Thérèse Cory. I'm the director of the Maritain Center here, and it's my pleasure to welcome you to our session on History of Philosophy, Aquinas and Albert. This is one of the most important historical contexts that Aquinas has, is his relationship with Albert, and understanding him in connection with Albert is very important. So I'm very happy that we had this panel to represent that methodology on our conference program. So we have 30 minutes for each paper, about 20 minutes for presentation, and then 10 for Q&A. And Francesco has asked me to let everyone know that since his flight is leaving a little bit early this afternoon, he might have to leave a little bit earlier before the end of the panel, so he's not storming out in protest of the Q&A for Sam. So just so everybody knows that in advance. So our first speaker is Francesco Binotto, who's a postdoctoral fellow at the University of Parma and the University of Urbino, and also soon to be a fellow at our History of Philosophy Forum later this semester. And the title of his talk is Finding Treasure While Digging a Grave, Thomas Aquinas versus Albert the Great on Fortuitous Events. Please help me welcome Dr. Binotto.
Thank you, Thérèse, and let me also thank the entire organizing committee for this amazing conference. Of course, because of time constraints, I have to skip some parts of my paper, and apologies in advance for that. Well, Aristotle's treatment of fortuitous events has sparked various interpretations. If it is certain that Aristotle admits the existence of fortuitous events, understood as events that happen in the minority of cases within the domain of human agency, it is debated how he accounts for the occurrence of such events. The question of how fortuitous events come about also puzzled medieval commentators on Aristotle's physics and metaphysics. In my presentation, I intend to compare, briefly at least, Albert the Great's and Thomas Aquinas' accounts of fortuitous events as developed in their commentaries on physics. Albert and Aquinas provide two different models for explaining how a fortuitous event arises. In brief, Albert holds that a fortuitous event accidentally follows from the accidental concurrence of two causes. As an example, let us consider the case of John finding treasure while digging a grave. Albert explains this event by appealing to two different per se causes, namely the action of grave digging performed by John and that performed by another person, let's say Peter, who hides the treasure found by John. On the other hand, Aquinas maintains that a fortuitous event identifies whatever accidentally happens to a per se effect and is not intended by a cause. To be precise, a fortuitous event qualifies the accidental conjunction of two effects, namely the per se effect and an accidental effect. To account for how John fortuitously finds treasure while digging a grave, it is sufficient for Aquinas to consider only one per se cause, that is, John's action of grave digging. Two effects follow from his action of digging: the dig, which is the per se and intended effect of John, and the finding of treasure, which is the accidental effect of the action performed by John, in the sense that John does not dig a grave with the purpose of finding treasure. Now, let me begin with Albert's account. Albert addresses the issue of how a fortuitous event comes about in his Physica 2.2, chapter 14. But in order to understand his position, it may be helpful to reconstruct the context within which he develops his interpretation of Aristotle's text. In chapter 12, commenting a passage from Aristotle Physics 2, chapter 5, Albert distinguishes between, first, what occurs always in the same way. Second, what occurs in the same way in most cases or frequently. And third, what occurs in the same way in the minority of cases. The first kind of events are caused by necessary causes, which are incorruptible in their substance and always perform their action without being impeded. The events that occur in most cases are caused by non-necessary causes, that is, causes that can be impeded in their action by the resistance of the recipient matter on which they operate. For Albert, both the first and the second kind of events are per se effects of per se causes. What differentiates them is that the former follow from non-impedible per se causes, whereas the latter follow from impedible per se causes. Instead, what happens if a minority of cases does not follow from a per se cause, but from an accidental cause, causa per accidens? More precisely, chance is the accidental cause of what happens in the minority of cases in the natural world, while fortune is the accidental cause of what happens in the minority of cases in the domain of human action and deliberation. Thus, fortuitous events identify those events that occur in the minority of cases in the realm of human agency and are accidentally caused by fortune. In accordance with Aristotle, Albert understands fortune as the accidental cause of fortuitous events. However, it is not yet clear what Albert means by accidental cause. An answer to this question can be found in text number 1 of the handout. And let me read it. An accidental cause is instead one that is attached to a per se cause through something which happens to it, namely to the per se cause, which is sometimes productive with respect to the effect, sometimes instead not. Like a builder's being a flute player is an accidental cause of the house on the grounds that the art of playing the flute does nothing for the house being built. Likewise, a builder's being strong is an accidental cause of the house, and his strength is productive with respect to it, so that the builder cuts wood vigorously with an axe in building the house. In this text, Albert outlines two aspects of the notion of accidental cause. The first aspect, point A, deals with the relation between a per se cause and an accidental cause, while the second aspect, point B, concerns the relation between an accidental cause and the per se effect. By point A, Albert emphasizes that an accidental cause is conjoined with a per se cause only accidentally. Namely, it does not depend on the essence of the per se cause. By providing the two examples, a builder's being a flute player and a builder's being strong, Albert spells out the meaning of accidental cause. An accidental cause identifies an essential property which inheres in the per se cause. This also means that an accidental cause, as such, relates to the per se effect only through the mediation of the per se cause in which it inheres. By point B, Albert underscores that an accidental cause is causally indeterminate with respect to an effect. An accidental cause can give an active contribution to the realization of the effect, as well as be causally inert. It is clear that for Albert, being causally inert does not essentially qualify an accidental cause as such. The fact that in some cases an accidental cause is causally inert does not imply that it cannot be causally active in other cases. In short, an accidental cause is said to be indeterminate with respect to its causal action, in the sense that each accidental cause is not essentially determined to be causally inert or active. The two examples Albert provides in text number 1 help us to shed light on both point A and B. In the first example, a builder's being a flute player can be considered an accidental cause of the house, since it is an accidental property of the per se cause in which it inheres, namely the builder. A builder qua builder is not essentially characterized by being a flute player. It remains such even though it cannot play the flute. In this case, we are dealing with an accidental cause, namely the builder's being a flute player, which does not contribute at all in producing the per se effect, namely the house. In the second example, Albert considers the case of a builder's being strong. This is an accidental cause of a house, insofar as it is an accidental property of the per se cause, namely the builder. The property of being strong is not in fact included in the definition of the essence of a builder qua builder. Yet, unlike the first example, a builder's being strong does causally contribute to the building of the house. Due to his strength, the builder can indeed cut wood with an axe and arrange it for the construction of a house. In summary, these two examples show that the notion of causa per accidens refers to a non-essential property which inheres in a per se cause. An accidental cause is also causally indeterminate with respect to the effect, in the sense that it can be causally productive entirely or in part, or inert with respect to the achievement of the effect. Therefore, affirming that fortune is an accidental cause of a fortuitous event would mean that it is an accidental property inhering in a per se cause and can be causally inert or efficacious entirely or in part with respect to the occurrence of such an event. Now, in light of what has been said so far, it remains unexplained how, for Albert, a fortuitous event comes about. In text number 2, Albert illustrates the conditions required for the arising of a fortuitous event. Let me quote, "Every fortuitous event is caused by two per se causes intended towards their per se effects, one of which is voluntary, a proposito, while the other is sometimes voluntary, sometimes natural, a natura, as is evident." In these lines, Albert gives us a criterion to identify fortuitous events. Each fortuitous effect or event follows from two different per se causes, whose actions are respectively intended to achieve their per se effects. One of these two per se causes must be voluntary, while the other may be a natural cause as well as a voluntary cause. Albert clarifies the description by offering two examples of fortuitous events, that of a casual meeting between two friends in a country house, and that of a grave digger who finds treasure while digging a grave. Now let us consider text number 3 of the handout. Meeting a friend in a country house without the purpose of meeting her may be considered a fortuitous event since it follows from two voluntary per se causes, that is, the two friends' wills, independent of each other, to go to the country house. Each of the two friends intends to go to the country house without the purpose of meeting the other. Understood in this way, the meeting between the two friends is an unexpected result of the concurrence of two different per se causes, each of which acts in view of its own purpose, namely reaching the country house. The case of the grave digger is, however, different. And now we can look at text number 4. Finding treasure while digging a grave can be considered a fortuitous event insofar as it can follow either from two per se voluntary causes or from the combination of a voluntary cause and a natural cause. In the first case, the first voluntary per se cause is the grave digger who digs the grave without the purpose of finding treasure, while the second voluntary per se cause can be the person who hid the treasure in the grave without wanting the grave digger to discover it. In the second case, given the grave digger as the voluntary per se cause, The natural cause can be the mineral composition of the soil which produced a grave in the place where there was treasure. Strictly speaking, both examples meet the criterion provided by Albert for fortuitous events to occur. A fortuitous event accidentally follows from the combination of two per se causes, one of which is a voluntary cause, while the other can be a voluntary or a natural cause. Finally, just let me stress just one point that lacks clarity in Albert's explanation of fortuitous events. As has been said, when Albert states that fortune is an accidental cause, he means that it is a non-essential property that inheres in a per se cause. However, in the two examples of fortuitous event we have briefly analyzed, Albert does not bring into play any of the accidental properties of the per se causes involved when explaining how the finding of treasure and the meeting in a country house come about. For instance, he does not clarify which accidental property inhering in the gravedigger plays the role of the accidental cause of the finding of treasure. Accordingly, Albert attributes no role to fortune in his explanation of the arising of fortuitous events. Now, second part, Thomas Aquinas. Okay, according to Thomas Aquinas' reading, Albert's account is ultimately inaccurate, precisely because it claims to explain fortuitous events without, however, specifying what role fortune, understood as an accidental cause, plays in their occurrence. In his commentary on physics, Aquinas corrects Albert's view and proposes a different account. Rather than an unintended result of the conjunction of two per se causes, Aquinas conceives of a fortuitous event as the accidental concomitance of two effects, namely the per se effect and an accidental effect, which follow, albeit in different ways, from the same cause. Such a cause plays the role of a per se cause with respect to the per se effect, and that of an accidental cause with respect to the accidental effect. In the Commentary on Physics, Book 2, Lectio 8, Aquinas too defends the view that chance and fortune may be considered as accidental causes. Like Albert, Aquinas first distinguishes between what occurs always, such as sunrise, what occurs in most cases, such as the birth of a human being with two eyes, and what occurs in the minority of cases, such as the birth of a human being with 6 fingers on one end or without eyes. What happens by chance or fortuitously coincides with this third kind of events, and the accidental cause of what happens in the minority of cases within the domain of human agency is called fortune. So far, so good. While holding that fortune is an accidental cause, Aquinas distinguishes two senses in which an accidental cause can be understood. First sense, on the side of the cause, ex parte causae, and second sense, on the side of the effect, ex parte effectus. According to the first sense, a cause is said to be accidental insofar as it is accidentally conjoined with a per se cause, in the same way as an accidental property is accidentally conjoined with the substance in which it inheres. And now we can see text number 5. An accidental cause is said to be on the side of the cause, ex parte causae, when it is conjoined with a per se cause, like if being pale or being a musician are called the causes of the house because they are accidentally conjoined with the builder. On the basis of this first sense of accidental cause, being pale or being a musician can be said to be accidental causes of the house, since both are accidentally conjoined with the per se cause of the house, namely the builder. As is evident, the notion of accidental cause understood as on the side of the cause matches Albert's conception. As said, for Albert, an accidental cause of an effect identifies an accidental property of the per se cause, such as a builder's being a flute player. The only difference is that while, according to Albert, an accidental cause can be causally active or inert, an accidental cause understood as ex parte cause always refers to, for Aquinas, an item that is causally inert. According to the second sense, a cause can be said to be accidental insofar as it is accidentally conjoined not with a per se cause, but with the effect. In this sense, the builder, who is the per se cause of a house, is the accidental cause of the disagreement that is generated once the house is built. Now you can see text number 6. I'm quoting, an accidental cause on the side of the effect, ex parte effectus, is instead something which is accidentally conjoined with the effect, as when we say that the builder is the cause of a disagreement because a disagreement follows from the building of the house. According to the second sense, being an accidental cause means being accidentally conjoined with the effect and contributing somehow to producing a fortuitous effect. If, according to the first sense, an accidental cause coincides with an item which does not produce anything, an accidental cause, understood according to the second sense, identifies an item which is causally active with respect to the occurrence of an effect. For Aquinas, it is precisely according to this second sense of causa per accidens that fortune can rightfully be said to be an accidental cause, as you can see in text number 7. As an example, Aquinas explicitly mentions the case of finding a treasure while digging a grave, as you can see in text number 8. By conceiving of fortune as an item that is accidentally conjoined with the effect of a per se cause, Aquinas is rejecting Albert's account of fortuitous event, and so his criterion for identifying such events. As one will recall, for Albert, a fortuitous event arises from the concomitance of two per se causes, one of which must be a voluntary cause, while the other can be voluntary or natural. For Aquinas, instead, a fortuitous event is what accidentally happens to a per se effect. Strictly speaking, it identifies the accidental conjunction between two effects, a per se effect and an accidental effect, both of which follow from the same cause, albeit in a different way. Between the per se effect and the cause, there is a per se causal relationship, while there is a per accidens causal relationship between the cause and the accidental effect. In Aquinas, finding treasure while digging a grave is considered a fortuitous event, insofar as the finding of treasure is accidentally conjoined with the grave that was dug, which is the effect of a per se cause, namely the grave digger who performs the action of digging. In this example, we are dealing with one per se cause, the grave digger, who causes its per se effect, the grave, and an accidental effect, the finding of treasure. Finding treasure is in fact accidental with respect to the action of digging and is beyond the intention of the grave digger, whose action is intended to dig a grave. Accordingly, although the grave digger is somehow productive with respect to the discovery of treasure, it does not intend to achieve that effect by digging a grave. Just one concluding remark. In conclusion, Aquinas' model for explaining fortuitous event focuses on what constitutes a fortuitous event as such, namely the accidental conjunction between a per se effect and an accidental effect which happens to the former. By contrast, Albert's explanatory model pays attention to what a fortuitous event derives from, namely the accidental conjunction between two per se causes. Thank you for your patience. I'm sorry.
So now we've got a few minutes for Q&A, and I'm going to bring the microphone around. Yes.
I noticed, I just want to, I guess my question is just for the sake of making sure I'm following everything. I noticed all of the examples you use involve human actions, and I'm wondering if anything changes if we're regarding simply like events in nature with no human cause. Like let's take, for instance, somebody plants a tree, and then some years later, the tree, because of the location, is hit by lightning and it burns. as opposed to an acorn falling, and because of the conditions of soil, it grows up into a beautiful tree until lightning hits it. So I guess my question is some sort of human actor or angelic actor or whatever, and some sort of like a intention on the level of a human required for an unintended effect to be considered accidental, or could we consider like events in nature with no human involvement accidental as well?
Thank you, Rebecca, for your question that gives me the opportunity to expand a little bit and to emphasize at least two limits of my paper. As you noted, I confine myself to consider only fortuitous events, which are events that involves human deliberation. The second important limit is that I confine my analysis only to Albert and Aquinas' commentaries on physics. But as for causal event, the question is a little bit different in the sense that the example provided both by Albert and Aquinas of causal events involve the question of a cause being impedible, namely the impediments, right? And it's striking in a certain way that when they both deal with fortuitous event, like the ones we have analyzed, they do not bring into play impediments, causal impediments, and the fact that there are impedible causes that sometimes fail to achieve their effect. Let me just add a little thing. In their commentaries on metaphysics, they treat about causal events, namely events that happen in the minority of cases within the domain of natural phenomena without involving human deliberation. But thank you, that is an important difference to determine the boundaries of my contention.
Well, you've inspired me to read, go back to the physics, so I'll look it up for myself.
Thank you.
Father James Dominic.
Thank you. This is, it's not very on. Okay. This is, thank you for the paper. I mean, I don't have anything very serious to say because I think you're right. But my only very, very mild comment, since no one else was going to say anything, it seemed, was on text 5. I was just worried about when you said in the presentation, your sort of translation, this is a sort of more idiomatic English kind of concern. But when we say the white or musical is the cause of the house, I think is how you translated it. I mean, I think we don't say white or musical is the cause of the house. We might say like the white person or the musical person maybe. So I wondered if maybe I'm incorrect on the grammar here.
No.
But album, the white one, or
let me double check.
maybe I'm correct. Maybe I'm wrong on the Latin here, but
I translated being pale, or being a musician, or a builder's being a flute player.
okay.
Correct? No, correct me. I'm not a native.
I think you guys are both agreed about the meaning. It's just a question of how to render it.
Okay.
Yeah, it was a very light point, but maybe just
No,
flag a question.
I'm interested.
Because like saying whiteness is the cause of the house is a
Okay.
bit strange, right?
Yeah.
And if you didn't say whiteness, you said what, being white, but even then it sounds a bit strange. So anyway, I don't know. Maybe that's just a question of rendering it a little bit more.
Thank you.
It's a very minor point.
I would think, no. Thank you so much. I will think about it, about how to render my translation, how to improve it. Thank you so much for your comment.
It seems to me at first glance that it's an ambiguity in the Latin.
Okay.
Because it looks like it's kind of like a substantive adjective.
Yeah, that's the reason why. Perhaps the most suitable translation is a builder's being pale or white, in order to explicit the fact that being white or being pale in years refers to the builder. Is a property, as a non-essential property of the builder, which inheres in him or in her. But thank you.
Yeah, I think there's a substantive philosophical point underneath this, which is whether the problem of of per se versus per accidens causality has to do with the builders having this accident, which is not giving the builder the power to bring about this cause, as opposed to something like the accident itself isn't a cause. And I mean, the 2 points are related to each other, but it seems importantly different whether we're putting the accent on the builder as opposed to on the accident.
As a matter of fact, one of the significant lack in my papers that I did not deal with the difference between per se causal relationship and per accidens causal relationship. I limited myself to mention this difference, but I did not deal with it. I did not engage with this difference. Thank you, Thérèse. That's a point. That's a point, actually.
Are there any other questions? Let us thank our speaker.
Thank you. Thank you.
And our second speaker is Bruce McCuskey, who's a doctoral candidate in medieval studies here at the University of Notre Dame. He's our resident Neoplatonic enthusiast. And he is going to speak on Albert and Aquinas on the problem of human knowledge of God.
Just to note, everyone, because the paper's rather broad and synoptic, I'm not actually going to read the text on the handout, but I will reference them by section number, etc., so you can look at them. There's plenty of Latin if you get bored. All right, and so thank you all for coming. Now, accounts of analogy or analogical predication seek to demonstrate how humans can have meaningful knowledge of God despite the great ontological disparity between him and us. Such knowledge is difficult to obtain, as Thomas famously says in Summa Theologiae 1:1. Only after a long time and with the admixture of many errors could it come about. It is possible, however, to identify different sources of that difficulty. Depending on what one judges to be the source of the difficulty to which accounts of analogy must respond, one will frame the knowledge of God problem differently, and thereby, if you're so inclined, result in a different account of analogy. This point, though, has often been neglected. Case in point, scholars have long noted that Thomas Aquinas' earliest discussion of analogy reproduces almost verbatim that of his teacher, Albertus Magnus. Yet, as has also been noted, Thomas abandons this account of analogy in his later writings. Most scholars have viewed this as a genuine advance on Thomas's part. On their analysis, the angelic doctor set aside Albert's flawed, insufficient solution in favor of a philosophically superior one. In this paper, however, I aim to show that that judgment is premature. Instead, Albert and Thomas's accounts of analogy are ultimately responding to different formulations of the knowledge of God problem, which arise from their identifying different divine attributes as the source of the difficulty. While Thomas focuses on divine simplicity, Albert consistently sees the problem as stemming from divine infinity. It will become clear that one cannot decide which account of analogy is superior until one decides which account of divine infinity is superior. So I will now briefly sketch both the account of analogy found in the writings of Albert and the early Thomas, and one of Thomas's later accounts of analogy. Now, this Albertist account of analogy grounds the similitude between God and creatures in the creature's imitation of God, and see 1a for the relevant text here. Here, imitation relies upon the communication of form. A creature's relationship to God is explained according to the imitative relationship that a creature has to its exemplar form in the divine mind. since no creature can represent the divine being perfectly in its imitation, but only produce an inadequate representation, there remains a deep and abiding dissimilarity between the two. Thus, when Albert speaks of an analogy of imitation, he does so only after having stressed the disparity between God and creatures. No creature can receive the form existing per essentiam in God according to the same ratio as it exists in God. One and the same form is communicated, but it can only be received in a limited fashion within creatures, which produces a difference in ratio. Now, crucial for Albert's understanding of analogy is the manner in which one and the same form is shared in common. In a salient passage from his commentary on the divine names, and this is text 1b on your handout, Albert, when dealing with the question whether all goods proceed from the first good, revisits the way in which the possession of one and the same form can lead to either univocal or analogical community. Form, he tells us, is twofold. The first kind is exemplary and held in common, not by predication, but by means of what proceeds from it. Here, it is not necessary that the exemplary form be participated univocally by all, but only according to the degree that the exemplary form can be imitated. So in contrast, there is also a form that is common, but only by predication, which is simply the form of a genus or species. Those proceeding from this latter kind of form are themselves of one genus or species, on account of which they enjoy a univocal community. Those things, however, proceeding from an exemplary form, in which particulars participate according to diverse modes, do not attain generic or specific unity, but only an analogical unity. With imitation, creatures represent, though only imperfectly, the absolute plenitude of the specific formal perfection proper to God, a perfection that can never be reproduced entirely. No creature is its own essential perfection, but enjoys its perfection as received. Albert holds that a creature's reception or participation consists in its partial or incomplete reception of some perfection that exists without limit in God. A creature's imitation of God is thus the source of both its similarity and its dissimilarity. Scholars like Bernard Montan and Victor Salas have argued that there seems to be a major problem with this Albertist account of analogy. What both Albert and the early Thomas want the analogy of imitation to be is a version of the one to another analogy, in which a secondary term is posterior to and dependent on another prior and primary term. By grounding the analogy in formal causality, though, it inadvertently becomes a many-to-one analogy. This kind of analogy is unsuited to describing the relationship between God and creatures because it risks subordinating both God and creatures to some prior and common category of being. Even if the form exists in a different mode in God and in creatures, a noetic univocity seems to transcend the differences in the corresponding modes of divine and creaturely being. This noetic univocity would impose a determinate distance between God and creatures, thereby compromising divine transcendence. To avoid this pitfall, Thomas supposedly rejected Albert's analogy of imitation as early as his Quaestiones Disputate de Veritate. But the most relevant contrast for the purposes of this paper is with his supposedly mature theory of analogy, found in the Summa Constantines, the Quaestiones Disputate de Potentia Dei, and the Summa Theologiae. There, Thomas again affirms the analogical similarity between God and creatures and explicitly notes that it's an analogy of one to another. Creatures can have meaningful knowledge of God insofar as God is the primary referent of terms for created perfections. In these latter accounts, though, formal causality does not ground the similarity between God and creatures. Instead, God's efficient causality grounds the similitude between them. What God communicates to creatures, then, is not primarily a form, but rather an actus essendi that images the complete identity of essence and existence in God. Consequently, one recognizes the analogy between God and creatures primarily at the level of judgment through which existence is originally known. Thomas's later, mature formulation supposedly avoids the scylla of equivocally emptying terms for God of any meaning, and the charybdis of the similitude being guaranteed by some third thing, namely a form, over and above both creatures and God. Recently, Joshua Hochschild has argued that Thomas's accounts of analogy across his writings are, however, too varied to constitute any kind of simple developmental schema. Although this may be true, and I think it is nevertheless the case that in his later works, Thomas never reproduced or endorsed Albert's analogy of imitation, rooted in formal causality. Even when he does employ terms like imitation, such as in question 3 of the prima pars of the Summa, he stresses that efficient rather than formal causality is at work. So why, then, does Thomas never return to Albert's account of analogy? To answer this question, I must return to my initial point. It is possible to identify different sources for the difficulty that gives rise to the knowledge of God problem, and thereby to frame the problem differently, which in turn sets different constraints on what would constitute an effective response. Now, many titans of 20th century Thomism, including Gilson, Maritain, Pascal, and Montaigne, have maintained that Thomas thinks that divine infinity is the source of the problem, and see section 2 of the handout for relevant quotations. After all, how could a finite mind know an infinite God? Hochschild, however, has forcefully argued that Thomas's account of analogy in the Summa is intended to respond to the problem insofar as divine simplicity gives rise to it. What neither the earlier generations of scholars nor Hochschild has noticed, however, is that Thomas actually changes his mind about which divine attribute gives rise to the problem, and consequently changes his framing of the problem. As the table in section 3 of your handout shows, in his early writings, Thomas followed Albert in identifying divine infinity as the source of the problem. But in his later writings, he consistently and clearly thinks that divine simplicity is the source of the difficulty. Thomas's change of mind contrasts with Albert's consistent framing of the problem. This difference is not merely terminological. The Albertist identification of divine infinity as the source of the problem focuses on how we know things through their forms. In drawing out exactly why infinity poses problem for normal modes of knowing, Albert emphasizes the conception of forms as limits. A form provides the limits of otherwise potentially infinite matter or potency. If God is infinite, however, then he lacks the limits that a form provides, which precludes the possibility that we could abstract a form when coming to know God. Hence, Albert's version of the knowledge of God problem is distinctly epistemological or even psychic in nature, with reference to the soul, of course. Yet so is Aquinas' early Albertist version of the problem. As Hochschild has shown, however, Thomas's latter version of the problem is more linguistic. The inherently composite nature of our language makes it seemingly impossible for us to speak about an utterly simple God without making him seem composite and thereby containing some potentiality. The theological semantics that Thomas develops in the Summa Theologiae would then be irrelevant to solving the knowledge of God problem had Thomas not changed his mind about what the source of the difficulty was. While the consequences of Thomas changing his formulation have come to light, it is now still unclear why he began identifying simplicity rather than infinity as the source of the problem. To understand this, it is necessary to examine Thomas's argument for the intrinsic infinity of God, which remains consistent from his commentary on the sentences to the Summa Theologiae. This argument has two parts. The first part, which you can see in section 4, number 2 of your handout, seeks to establish that the divine nature is infinite and can be formalized in the following way. The formal is infinite, God is maximally formal, Therefore, God is infinite. A presupposition of this argument is that forms are unlimited insofar as they are received in matter. This conception of form marks a notable shift from the assumption underlying Albert's formulation of the problem, whereby forms are conceived of as limits. Importantly, Aquinas argues for God's maximal formality in question 3, article 2 of the Summa, the question on divine simplicity. There he argues that God cannot be composed of matter and form because, on the one hand, matter is sheer potentiality, so that God, as actus purus, can contain no matter, and on the other hand, since everything composed of matter and form owes its perfection and goodness to its form, and God is goodness itself, every agent acts by its form, and so the manner in which it has its form is the manner in which it is an agent. Therefore, whatever is primarily and essentially an agent must be primarily and essentially form. Since God is the first agent, he is therefore, of his essence, form, not composed of matter and form. Now, the second part of Thomas's argument for divine infinity seeks to demonstrate the uniqueness of God's essential infinity. And you can see this in 4.4 of your handout. The argument could be reformulated in the following way. To be infinite simpliciter requires that something be its own being and not receive its being. No creature is its own being. They all receive being from another. Only God is his own being. Therefore, only God is infinite simpliciter. Although his stated goal in Article 2 is to demonstrate the uniqueness of divine infinity, Aquinas devotes much of the Respondeo to explaining how creatures can nevertheless be relatively infinite. In each case, entities will be relatively infinite in relation to those things lower than them on the chain of being. For example, forms that exist uncontracted to matter, either as angels or abstracted forms, will be relatively infinite with respect to enmattered forms. For some commentators, this raises a problem. Thomas seems to be treating forms both as limits and as infinite. How exactly does he get this notion of relative infinities off the ground? Thomas draws his answer to this question from Proposition 17 of the Liber de Causis, and this is 4.5 on your handout. Specifically, the simpler the being of a thing is, the greater its power and the more comparatively infinite it will be. In the Liber de Causis' reception of Neoplatonic metaphysics, determination by multiple causal agents, which is the case for beings lower on the ontological hierarchy, decreases the simplicity of a being because each of the agents actualizing it contributes an essential characteristic, thereby increasing its compositeness. Thus, the analogical movement up the chain of being toward the absolute infinity of God is achieved through a series of moves towards ever greater simplicity. This move answers the worry over how forms can be both absolutely finite and relatively infinite. It also demonstrates that, for Thomas, God is infinite because he is as simple as possible. It should come as no surprise, then, that Thomas gradually adjusts his formulation of the knowledge of God problem to focus on what he takes to be the more fundamental attribute. Moreover, the fact that Thomas increasingly stresses that God's infinity is coextensive with his being maximally formal lessens the epistemological challenge posed by infinity. Since we know things by their forms, the maximally formal character of divine infinity entails for Thomas that it is God's lack of composition, rather than his infinity, that frustrates our normal modes of knowing. The increasing stress on God's simplicity also can help explain why Aquinas never fully returned to the early Albertist account of analogy. That God's distinction from creation relies on his utter simplicity means that grounding the similarity between God and creatures in a form present in both was untenable. Now, while I've explained why Thomas was likely to depart from Albert's account of analogy, I have not shown that Thomas's later account of analogy is an improvement over Albert's. It is only an improvement for Thomas given the restrictions imposed by his own reduction of infinity to simplicity. So instead of telling the simple story of how the dumb ox became unyoked from his master, I want to close with an exploration of how Albert's account of analogy succeeds in responding to his own version of the knowledge of God problem. The apparent problem for Albert's analogy of imitation is that it compromises divine transcendence, because the exemplar that grounds the similitude between God and creatures would be something over and above both that, but would be something over and above both, which would condition each of them. Specifically, the concern is that even if an ontological gulf remains, noetically, their relationship is apprehended according to an overarching form that abolishes the difference between them. This criticism, though, presumes that the forms are each present in God in such a way that coming to know the forms and predicate them of God would entail knowledge of the divine nature. For this to be the case, however, one must presume a Thomistic reduction of infinity to simplicity. A different picture of the relationship between infinity and simplicity could extricate Albert from this critique, and that is exactly what he has. In both his commentary on Pseudo-Dionysus and his commentary on the Liber de Causis, these are texts 5, 1 through 3 in your handout, Albert distinguishes between two different modes of God's being correlate with two different modes of infinity. On the one hand, properly speaking, God is neither finite nor infinite. On the other hand, in other sections of these and other works, Albert clearly affirms the infinity of the divine essence. Albert is clear that these are not simply two different modes of speaking. God is properly called infinite insofar as he is the measure of all things on the chain of being, the unlimited limit for the Procleans in the room, while being unlimited by anything on the chain itself. Hence, God is infinite in this sense ad extra. Furthermore, God's infinity with respect to creation is constituted by the divine fluxus, which is the outward flow of being that constitutes God's creative activity. Albert stresses that the fluxus itself is still infinite, extending infinitely above and below the chain of created beings. Considered in se, however, Albert maintains that God transcends the distinction between infinity and finitude. In making this move, he is following the assertion of the Liber de Causis that God is supra infinitum. Thus, one could say that for Albert, God can be deemed infinite in one sense and what I'm calling hyper-infinite in another sense. The hyper-infinite mode of God, considered in se, is utterly beyond all speech and knowledge, other than that God's hyper-infinity is the source of the fluxus. So this is a distinction that Albert makes and that Thomas does not. It helps explain why Albert is more interested in exploring how a finite mind could come to know an infinite God. To explain how natural knowledge of God is possible, he must navigate between two metaphysical cum epistemological rather than semantic guardrails. On the one hand, he must give an account of how knowledge of God is possible in the face of his account of divine infinity that stresses the connection between infinity and ineffability. On the other hand, he must do so while remaining within the boundaries of an epistemological framework in which knowledge is gained through forms. Albert puts his distinction between two modes of divine infinity to further philosophical ends. He distinguishes between different modes in which the exemplar forms are said to exist in God. Insofar as they are considered existing in God in se, in God's hyperinfinity, the forms cannot be distinguished at all, even in ratio. This is text 5.4 on your handout. In the divine fluxus, however, the ideas are present and distinct in ratio. At this level, the distinction of the ideas in God allows the analogical relation of similarity to arise. Albert is clear that when one predicates a name of God drawn from creatures, one is not primarily predicating it of the divine essence to core, but rather primarily of the exemplar form as it exists in distinct in ratio in God. This is text 5.5 on your handout. Given the distinction between God's infinity and hyperinfinity, however, this means that analogy is in fact offering a far weaker relation of similarity to God than an initial recognition that formal causality grounds the similitude might indicate. One grasps the same form that is present in the divine fluxus, but one also thereby predicates it primarily of the exemplar form, not of the fluxus as a whole. It becomes a name for God only insofar as it connotes the fluxus. Furthermore, not even the fluxus should be taken as the ground for the noetic relationship. Rather, the utterly ineffable, hyper-infinite being of God constitutes the principle of intelligibility that is not itself intelligible. The fact that the forms cannot be distinguished even in ratio at the hyper-infinite level precludes them from establishing any determinate distance between God and creatures. And the fact that the exemplar form is grasped primarily through analogy rather than the fluxus itself forestalls the establishment of any determinate distance. So what I have shown is that we cannot judge which account of analogy is superior until we come down firmly on which account of divine infinity is superior. Thank you.
Thank you, Bruce. We've got just 5 minutes for questions. I'll bring the microphone around. So, Francesco.
Thank you. Thanks a lot. Just a question. So I don't know Albert much. So this is more like a Albert clarification thing. So to my understanding, Aquinas' account of simplicity is related to his account of the triplex via, right? So like the Dionysian inspired triplex via, causality, negation, supraeminence, and the way it looks to me that the way in the first part of the Summa, the way in which he gives this sort of like priority to simplicity over infinity, over perfection, depends upon his account of the triplex via. So I wonder, like, does Albert have a similar account in natural theology, like inspired by Dionysius?
So Albert in his accounts of analogy is far more, like he follows the triplex via far more strictly than Aquinas, actually, I would say. I mean, I think, the account of analogy you're getting in the Summa, for example, is one that is not like it's not actually following that third mode of analogy that is laid out in the mystical theology. It's one where you're trying to make positive predications of perfections to God, which is only the second level. And so I think if you want an idea of what Albert is doing with the two kinds of infinity that relates to the mystical theology, is what he's doing is he's reading the distinction between divine light and divine darkness into the modes of God's being in se and ad extra. So does that get some way to answering your question? Yeah, I'd say Albert actually follows the triplex via more closely than Aquinas.
Sam, I think you're next, and you could just use that microphone.
Okay. So I was really curious by this notion of the fluxus and how the fluxus. I know usually on Albert's view, the fluxus gets kind of contracted and limited by the recipient. Mm-hmm. So I'm wondering in this case of the prime fluxus, if you will, what's it being received in, and what's the principle of limitation by which the forms can then be distinguished in ratio?
So you mean the principle of limitation in God?
Well, I thought the fluxus was already an emanation from God, and that's why they don't.
Well, so the analogy he uses is actually that between a point and light emanating from the point, and so the way in which in the hyper-infinite being of God, it's just simply contained, and there's no distinction between the rays coming out from the central light point, and then once you actually move away, the rays become distinct. And so the idea is that when God begins to emanate or flow out the being, is that there must be some sort of distinction, at least in ratio, to then ground the distinction that's going to happen in creation.
So this emanation's intrinsic to or extrinsic to God?
It's intrinsic to God. It doesn't mean that creation is eternal, but it's that the fluxus is always coming out. It's just that it's only on his account of creation received at the moment of creation. It's only actually received. But he's clear that the fluxus is always flowing out.
I'm not sure how to word this as a question. It's going to come out more like a comment, but maybe you could turn in a question by commenting on the comment. And I am relying on your account of Albert as I understood it, because I'm not as intimately familiar with him as you are. Based on how I understood him in your presentation, it sounds like Albert is doing something pretty much the same as what Plato does with the form. So with Plato, there's a univocal meaning to the form itself. There's a univocal meaning to the word, and let's say we're talking about beauty, but it's participated in different ways by different creatures. So if we want to go by the greater Hippias, I know it's disputed whether it's by Plato. I personally believe it is. A beautiful vase is no longer beautiful when compared to a beautiful monkey. And the most beautiful of monkeys is ugly compared to a beautiful maiden, and the maiden is herself ugly when compared to a god, because all of them participate in this one univocal thing, beauty, but they don't participate to it in the same degree. Or there are other instances where it's not really a question of degree, but a question of different ways. So an octopus and a dog are both animals in the same sense, but not in the same way. I'm using the sense-way distinction, kind of going by Gail Fine. Anyway, we don't use the word analogy when referring to Plato. Maybe that's just because he himself doesn't call it analogy, and yet it seems to me, based on your account of Albert, that Albert's kind of doing the same thing of Plato, of the concept itself is the same, but the way in which it's participated is different. It seems to me that's going back to Plato, which Albert himself might not have realized.
Well, so it's actually, it's Albert actually thinks it's explicitly going back to Plato in a certain sense. So in the commentary on the Liber de Causis, he thinks that Plato's forms, and he says, well, Plato put the forms in, I can give you the quote later, Plato put the forms in the light of the first agent intellect, which is another term he has for the fluxus. So it's interesting that he actually thinks Plato's forms are only sort of at the level of the fluxus, and he thinks that sort of the higher level, which Dionysius reached in the comment when he talks about this in both commentaries, is that level of God's hyperinfinity, the in se infinity. Yeah. Mm-hmm.
All right, let's thank our speaker. And our next presentation, it's very quiet. Our next presentation is by Sam Pell, who is a doctoral candidate in philosophy here at the University of Notre Dame, and his paper topic is "Let Him Say What He Likes, But I Don't Understand Him at All. Albert the Great on Aquinas' Theory of Universals, but surely not the audience on Sam's paper." So, Sam.
Well, that last remark remains to be seen. Albert the Great wrote his commentary on the posterior analytics between 1254 and 1257. Albert writes in a rather conversational style, frequently punctuating his text with diatribes and digressions. One such diatribe concerns a theory of abstraction provided by Al-Farabi. Albert appears to disapprove of the theory, saying it is not necessary in my judgment, but after summarizing it, he adds that it is approved of by Avicenna, Al-Ghazali, and certain others, those others comprising, quote, many, nearly all of the Latins. At this point, Albert clarifies that he's not going to criticize Al-Farabi's view, but then goes on to do just that, offering what seem to be 4 devastating objections to the things that the friends of Al-Farabi say. Albert closes by walking back these objections, saying that anyone can say whatever they like because I'm not going to judge any of them. He observes, however, that the views he criticizes he is, quote, in no way able to understand. In this talk, I will show that the views Albert criticizes are in fact views that were held in this period by Thomas Aquinas, Albert's star pupil and the namesake of this conference. Aquinas was a student at Paris while Albert was writing his commentary. Albert indeed visited Paris in 1256 in order to collect information for a papal commission in which he defended the Dominicans against the attacks of the secular clergy. This visit also coincided with Aquinas' being awarded the degree of Master of Theology. If Albert wrote the commentary after this visit, it is possible that his diatribe is the tortured cry of a teacher whose student has departed from his doctrine. Even if I'm wrong about this historical analysis and Albert is not directly responding to Aquinas, we have here an instance in which Albert is directly criticizing a view that Aquinas in fact held. A careful analysis of Albert's criticisms, then, can yield a deeper understanding of the philosophical differences between these two men. In particular, I'll highlight how each offers a unique response to the challenge of Averroism that was kind of lurking in the background at this period. On Albert's view, the objects of thought are genuine universals that exist in our intellects, nevertheless without belonging to our intellects. On Aquinas' view, the objects of thought are singular perfections in an individual knower, and as such are properly the knower's own. So Albert starts his digression by giving a summary of Al-Farabi's view. I'm not going to read the entire summary, but the parts that are relevant to our discussion is you have a singular in sense, and then through some process of abstraction, you get what's called the singular in the intellect. Now, I don't think we should take this to mean that the intellect's object is singular, as if Al-Farabi is claiming here that the intellect cognizes singulars. I think the phrase singular in the intellect just means that the intelligible form is singular in its being. It's an accident of the soul, as Albert says, namely the individual soul. That's what makes it a singular in the intellect. When the intellect operates on some way on the singular in the intellect, you get a universal in the intellect on this summary of Al-Farabi's view. Albert says that on Al-Farabi's view, the intellect makes the universal in universality from the singular things it has apprehended on account of its seeing one ratio in all of them. So as we'll see, Albert's issues mainly concern this notion of a singular in the intellect. That's what he has the most difficult time understanding. The first objection concerns this notion that the singular in the intellect is an individual accident of the soul. So we have a few places here where Albert takes issue with this. He says, certain people say that the universal is individuated through the intellect as through a subject, which is not the opinion of Aristotle nor of the Peripatetics. He then says, the opinion of those who say that the universal exists in the intellect through an individual existence, or esse individuum, as in a subject, I am in no way able to understand. And then he says, it is not in the intellect like an accident in the subject, nor is the intellect receptive of a universal in this way. So this part of the theory that Albert has singled out for criticism is actually a view that Aquinas espouses to in print during this period. Although Aquinas never uses the term singular in the intellect, he does seem to think that the intelligible forms are individual accidents of the intellect. And here's a text from De Ente et Essentia that shows just that. Although the understood nature has the ratio of a universal, inasmuch as it is compared to things outside the soul, since it is one similitude of all, nevertheless, inasmuch as it has existence in this or that intellect, it is a certain particular understood species. So on Aquinas' view, the intelligible species is individual or singular in its esse, in its being. It's only universal in its ratio. And to go back to the Al-Farabist summary that we saw earlier, the intellect makes the intelligible species universal by comparing it to things outside of the soul and seeing that it has a ratio that is a similitude of all. And again, this is Aquinas' De Ente et Essentia. He would have written it while he was at Paris, before the time Albert visited Paris. So when Albert visited Paris, Aquinas would have held this view. And even if Albert and Aquinas didn't particularly discuss this issue in Paris, remember, Albert said all the Latins held this view. So at least some of those Latins presumably were at Paris, since that's the major center for studying Islamic philosophy in this period. So even if Albert isn't directly responding to Aquinas, he seems to be responding to contemporary trends that Aquinas is definitely picking up, at least on the basis of this passage. And I have some others that we'll talk about later. So what's Albert's objection against this view that's held by Al-Farabi, certain people, Al-Ghazali, Avicenna, all the Latins, and as we've now seen, Aquinas? Albert says that if this view held, it would follow that the intellect would be denominated by any of its intelligibles in the way that a subject is denominated by its accident. And just as a man is said to be white or black or colored or such, the intellect would be called human by the human form, and asinine by the asinine form, and wooden by the form of wood, which is absurd. So Albert's picture is just as whiteness denominates the subject in which it inheres, making the body in which it inheres white, Albert thinks the intelligible species of asininity is going to denominate the intellect, if indeed the intelligible species is an accident of the intellect. So to riff off the words of a great and renowned Thomistic scholar, the intelligible species of asininity would assify your intellect, making your intellect an instance of asinine thinking. Uh-oh. We'll call this the making an ass out of yourself objection. But how can Albert avoid this consequence? We do want to say that the intelligible species is in the intellect. And you might think that if something is in the intellect, then it's an accident of the intellect. But Albert would say that assumption is wrong. Albert thinks things can be present in a subject without being accidents of the subject. And in a quote on Albert's positive view, the stock example he gives is the visible species or intensio in an illuminated medium. And as we'll see, he thinks there's a very tight analogy between the visible species or intensio in the medium and the intelligible intensiones that are in the intellect. So I'm going to give a brief summary of Albert's theory of light and vision with an aim to moving it towards the analogy with intellect. But on Albert's theory of vision, the form of light is color. Sorry, the form of color is light. And specific colors are just determinations of the form of light. So Albert thinks it's the same form of color emanating from a light source or from the sun, filling the air in the room and existing in a more determinate way on the surface of bodies. And as the light goes from the sun through the air to the body, it gets contracted to the various bodies in which it interacts and determined to the particular colors of those bodies. Bruce was talking about the fluxus of all things from God. It's a very similar idea here from the sun. Once it gets contracted and determined to a specific color, it can multiply its determinate nature through the medium. And that's the visible species or intensio that the eye sees. So I had a kind of clear light coming off the sun, and then I have a like green ray in your handout coming off of the object and going into the eye. That's the intensio. So here's the key part. Albert says that the intensio of a determinate color that goes off of the object through the medium and into the eye is not in the medium or eye as in a subject. Rather, Albert says the intensio is a self-multiplication of the determinate form of the bodily color. The intensio does not inhere in the medium or the eye in the way it inheres in a colored body, and because of this, it doesn't denominate the medium or the eye. It doesn't make the eye colored, and it doesn't make the medium colored. And for this reason, Albert thinks two intensiones can simultaneously cross paths in the medium. And here we're on the top of the page after the sun. The visible, acting only through its form and not materially, generates its own simple form in the actually illuminated medium as spiritual and intentional being. But this form does not qualify the medium, because if it did qualify it, it would not be possible to see black and white from the same point of air. But this is indeed possible. So Albert's thought here is that I can see the gray wall from back there, and John can see the, red on the fire extinguisher. So the two intensiones cross paths in the medium, which means that somehow gray and red have to be co-located. Now, colors are usually contraries of one another, so if those two qualities were both predicated of the same patch of air, then you'd have contradictories true of the same thing at the same time, which of course is impossible. But since Albert thinks these are immaterial forms that are physically located in this patch of air but nevertheless crossing paths, he thinks matter is the source of contrariety. So if these are existing without matter, they aren't denominating the medium, they aren't making the medium a certain way. And so they're not qualifying the medium, and therefore they can be co-located because they're immaterial and also because they're not inhering in the medium. They're just kind of these free-floating forms that are co-located. Here's another important point. When species exist in the medium without inhering in the medium, they are neither specified nor individuated by the light in the illuminated medium. So they're not specified. The intensio of a green object remains green even if it exists in the non-green medium in my non-green eye. They're not individuated. It remains the color of the green body even as it travels through the medium and the eye. So Albert says the intensio is predicated of the thing, that is, of the colored body. Its species in sight is the species of the colored thing inasmuch as it is colored. So that's why when I see the colored object and not just something in my eye. Well, I do see something in my eye, but the thing in my eye just is the color of the object. It still belongs to the object. So this is a really cool theory, but there's some really weird metaphysics going on here. The intensio in the medium receives its generic form of light from the celestial body or the light source, its specific form, light's determination of color, from a body's surface qualities. It's individuated by the object from which it originates, and yet it exists in the medium, or the eye. On Albert's view, an intensio can exist in a body, the medium in the eye, while being part of another body, the object, and also being partially constituted by an emanation from a third body, namely the sun. On Albert's view, existence in, individuation by, and inherence in can all come apart in ways they can't for Aquinas. You might think this theory is kind of ridiculous, but Albert thinks this actually saves him from making an ass out of himself. So Albert thinks that the intellect is like the illuminated medium. It receives its illumination from a separate substance called the datra formarum that emanates universal forms into the world and into intellects in the same way that the sun emanates visible forms into the world and into sense organs. The intellect, thus illuminated by the datra formarum, itself illuminates the form and the phantasm. giving the form in the phantasm the generic character of intellectuality or intelligibility, in the same way that the sun gives the intensio the generic character of light. The intelligible form retains its specific determination of asininity from the phantasm, even as it is emanated into the intellect, in the same way that the color, the intensio, retains its specification to the color on the surface of the body. This intelligible form does not denominate the intellect when it's in it, any more than a visible species denominates the medium or the intellect. This intelligible form is not just asininity, it's universal asininity for reasons I'll explain later. But just as the visible species remains individuated by the object from it originated, remaining the color of that object, the intelligible can retain its lack of individuation, that is, its universality, even as it exists in a particular intellect. So this is how Albert avoids Averroism. You can have a universal in the intellect without the universal being universal, without the intellect being universal, because the universal is not an attribute of the intellect, it just exists in it without denominating it. The intelligible species can remain the universal form of asininity, even as it exists in a non-universal, non-assified intellect, since it can exist in the intellect without inhering in and without denominating that intellect. Albert says, what is understood is called intellectual according to its being, that is the being it receives in the intellect, and universal according to its own potency, that is intrinsically. But the intellect is not called universal or human or asinine. So in response to this brilliant solution by Albert, you might expect Aquinas to cede to his teacher and just say everything he's written is straw, but no, not yet. Aquinas writes the Questiones Disputate de Veritate in 1256 to 1259, which is most likely after Albert wrote his posterior analytics commentary. And he considers the question whether an angel can cognize many things at once. And he says that forms are said to exist in a subject in three ways. In one way, they exist in perfect act, and when whiteness exists as the term in the process of becoming white. And in this way, it is impossible for two forms of one genus to exist at the same time in the same subject. Then he says, insofar as the intellect understands an act, it is necessary that it be in perfect act with respect to that species according to which it understands. And therefore, likewise, it is impossible that it understand an act according to diverse forms at the same time in the same way. So this argument depends on the presupposition that intelligibles exist in the intellect in the exact same way that whiteness exists in a body. It's an individual accident inhering in an individual subject and is a perfection of that subject, and not just some free-floating thing that emanates into the intellect. And so when the intellect actually understands, its species is in perfect act in the same way that a totally white thing is in perfect act with respect to its whiteness. So Aquinas is doubling down here. An objector wonders along very Albertist lines whether an angelic intellect can contain many species in the same way that a medium can contain many species. So, I mean, the text of the objection very much is reticent of that Albert passage I read. The objector says, in air there can be diverse forms at the same time, such as white and black, just as if white and black are seen by diverse viewers, and he sketches out the exact same scenario Albert considered earlier. Aquinas' response are that those forms are not in air except in a state of becoming. And in the corpus, Aquinas had defined a state of becoming as when, or given an example as a state of becoming, as when something is in the process of changing from black to white. And he thinks this occurs in the mind in the case of habitual cognition, not actual cognition. So Aquinas is giving a different metaphysical analysis for co-located colors that does not require Albert's strange way for forms to exist in subjects without inhering or denominating them. If I'm going from, or I don't know, if my coat's going from black to white because I'm bleaching it and is gray, well, it has both blackness and whiteness in it at the same time. Same thing's going on in the medium, but that doesn't require this kind of existence without denomination or without inherence. So on Aquinas' view, the intelligible species is an actuality of the intellect. Sadly, on Albert's picture, Aquinas has bitten the bullet. He's made an ass out of himself. But here's a more serious worry. Presumably, the intelligible species is supposed to be universal. If the intelligible species adheres in and therefore denominates the intellect, wouldn't that mean that the intellect would have to be universal, for the same reason that would have to be asinine? This is, in fact, Averroes' argument for the universality of the intellect. Averroes thinks that if the object of intellection is universal, then the intellect in which this object exists would also have to be universal. So maybe Aquinas is okay biting the bullet on the making an ass out of himself objection, but he certainly isn't okay being an Averroist. Fortunately for us, Albert's second objection directly concerns the nature of universality, so we can consider this issue in more detail. We can also revisit the issue we discussed earlier about how intelligible forms could remain universal in Albert, given that they're coming from the phantasm, which is not universal, and the intellect, which is also not universal. As we'll see, Albert's view is that all forms are universal as an intrinsic mode of their being, although this universality can be suppressed when they are contracted to matter and determined by various accidental forms. On Aquinas' view, no forms are universal in their being. Universality is just a way of describing the way that immaterial forms, inhering in particular intellects, can be used to think about many material bodies. So Albert is going to give a very realist account of universals. I'm going to summarize this a little quickly since we're running short on time. Universality is an intrinsic attribute of the forms that emanate from the universal datra formarum. These forms become particular when they contract to different portions of prime matter. They also receive a further determination, becoming singular, when they bundle together with other forms to make an individual composite with many accidental forms. Light abstracts forms from the particularity of matter and sends them through the medium as an intensio. The imagination separates the forms in the intensio from one another so that the intellect can consider one at a time. Albert says that the cause of individuation is matter and the proper accident. When this cause ceases, the universal remains universal from its own nature and substance. So I take from all of this that Albert is a Platonic realist about universals. Forms have universality as their intrinsic character, which gets contracted and determined in their interactions with other forms and material bodies. This is very similar to the way that light from the sun gets contracted and determined to a particular color of a particular body. Albert assumes that universality is an intrinsic feature of forms, and that the form can only become singular by some kind of contraction or determination on the side of the form. This is why he thinks Al-Farabi's idea of the singular in the intellect is so absurd. How can a form in the intellect, with all its contractions and determinations stripped away, remain singular? Its intrinsic nature is to be a universal, and there's nothing singularizing it. And he offers a few objections along the lines where even if they pure impossibly could remain singular in the intellect, they would all resemble each other exactly, which would render them at best redundant and at worst in contradiction to Leibniz's law. So that's what Albert's objections to the notion of a singular in the intellect amount to, which I'm not going to read. But if we look at Aquinas, we see that Aquinas actually holds a very different view of universality. On Aquinas' view, and I'm just going to summarize this passage, it's not like humanity and whiteness are numerically one universal thing that gets contracted and determined across all its instances. Rather, all forms are intrinsically singular, individuated by the subjects in which they inhere. Some get called universal because they can be used to think about many things, but they are still singular in their being. So to summarize, Albert's intelligible species are universal in their ratio or character and in their esse or mode of being. Aquinas' intelligible species are universal only in their ratio. They are individual in their mode of being. Because Albert's intelligible species are universal in their esse, they cannot denominate the intellect. If they did denominate the intellect would have to be universal too, and Albert would have to hold to the Averroist thesis that there's one intellect for all men. To prevent his intelligible species from denominating the intellect, Albert comes up with a theory on which visible and intelligible species or intentiones do not inhere in the subjects in which they exist. But since Aquinas' intelligible species are individual in their esse, they can inhere in an individual intellect without making that intellect universal. He doesn't have to tell the complicated story about inherence that Albert told. But unfortunately, since the intelligible species are the forms of the things they represent, Aquinas does make an ass out of himself. But most students who disagree with their teachers make asses out of themselves. Just ask Jeff Brower. But this, as Jeff always reminds me, is an important stage in the development of the student. For in making an ass out of oneself, one develops the individuality of one's own thought as distinct from that of one's teacher. In Aquinas' case, it was not just the individuality of his own thought he was after, but the individuality of human thought in general. On Albert's view, the objects of thought were genuine Platonic universals that originated in a celestial intellect and emanated into our intelligence when the conditions of the imagination were right. Those objects of thought were therefore not our own. They were present in our intellect without belonging to or inhering in our intellect. On Aquinas' view, our thoughts are our own. They are actualities of our own mind, and the universality of thought we attain through them is our own singular achievement, which we attain by bringing our minds from its native potency to the full perfection that the consideration of the object demands. Aquinas can describe this process and praise those who attain it with the dignity that befits their singular accomplishment. And for that, you can assify my intellect any day.
All right, we've got 6 minutes for questions.
Thank you, Sam. I'm worried this might open a can of worms. But when you say that, talk about the objects of intellect, do you mean that what we think it's the object? Is that what we think about? What we think about is the object.
Yeah, so that's a very good point. So I think on Albert's view, those two things are going to go together. On Aquinas, there is some distinction. I think in general, I just mean what actualizes the intellect in a very, very loose sense is the object of the intellect.
Thank you very much, Sam. That was really fun. This might be along similar lines to the
Sure.
object question. So you contrasted Albert with Aquinas in terms of Albert having the form be universal in itself, with Aquinas having the form be individual in itself.
Sure.
But at least one could read the De Ante to say that the form, assuming that by form in essence we mean the same thing, and maybe you don't mean that, but you could argue that the form, the essence, is neither individual nor universal in itself. And it's precisely because the object of our thought is the form in itself, not as it exists either in our mind or in things, that it can do its job. So would that affect your argument if you run it that way?
Yeah, so the De Ante passage that I quoted, he says he talks about the understood nature. So I think by that he means the intelligible species, which is not singular, which is singular in its being. But because it's free from matter, you can use it to think of many enmattered individuals. So then I guess in the De Ante, he also talks about the nature absolutely considered, which I guess is the object of. And so I guess you're saying that the nature absolutely considered isn't yet a universal because it kind of prescinds from universality. Yeah, so I guess, but by considering the nature absolutely considered, you can get a universal, I think is kind of the view. Which might find resonance in Albert's summary of Al-Farabi, where you have this singular in the intellect that isn't yet universal, and you make the universal by considering the singular. But I want to remain as neutral as possible about the extent to which Aquinas holds the details of this Al-Farabist view. But I definitely think he holds to the parts of it that Albert explicitly criticizes.
Other questions?
Thanks, Sam. I wanted to ask you just a curiosity question about this passage.
Sure.
From De Veritate. Oh, no, it's Disputed Questions on Truth.
Yeah.
So Aquinas says it's impossible for two forms of one genus to exist at the same time, the same subject. Which genus do you think that is?
Intelligibility. So he says that all intelligible forms are of the genus of intelligible, and then their species is determined by what thing you're thinking about.
Okay. But is that a perfectly general claim? That goes, so would the genus be the first genus above the lowest species?
I'm not exactly sure. That's a really good question. I think it would be the highest genus, because then, if you're thinking about a species, then you'd want to say, I'm thinking about an intelligible substance, an intelligible bodily substance, an intelligible animated bodily substance. So it seems like the natural place for intelligibility to go is before everything else. But maybe, I guess, if you want to say that the intelligible is within the genus of accident, then maybe accident comes ahead of it. Yeah.
Thank you.
I've got one
Sure.
very quick question. So this is about your commentary De Anima text from Albert 235. So this is the text you cited in support of the claim that the intensio remains the color of the body even as it exists in the medium in the eye.
Yeah.
So there's a strong sense in which we could take that by
Yeah.
saying, right, it's in the medium in some sense, but it's still the color that inheres in the eye. Like it's some kind of numerical identity. But the text itself says the intention, because it is abstracted from the whole and is the signification of the whole, is predicated of the thing. And I was wondering if that might legitimate a somewhat weaker claim, which is that, well, it's predicated of, but is that strong enough to say that it remains the color of the body even as it exists, as opposed to, oh, it's another form, and because the kind of form it is, it can be predicated of the body.
Yeah. I guess on my read of Albert, predication and inherence are closely related, but I realize it does lend itself to this weaker reading as well. I do think there does have to be something to individuate it. It's not individuated by the air. It's not an accident of the air. So if you ask a question like, what is this the intensio of? It seems it's definitely the intensio of the body. I wouldn't necessarily say that the intensio inheres in the body for that reason, but I think the most natural answer to the question, what does it belong to, is the body, and whether how we cash that out versus a kind of weaker predication claim or a stronger individuation claim, I think is, I have to think about that some more.
Okay, thank you. Let's thank our speaker.